We would like to begin with a slight delay. I apologize. My name is Jelena Trkulja. I'm the editorial director of Qatar Creates Talks. And today is the second day of our talks in this spring-summer edition. Welcome. We will have 3 talks today. And we will begin with, we can move to the next slide, the future of cultural institutions, balancing tradition, innovation, and global audiences. I think with a very current topic, because we live in an era of extraordinary change, from political turbulence and climate crisis to digital disruption and urgent calls for inclusion and accountability. So cultural institutions today are called to do more than just collect and to conserve. They're expected to respond, engage, and sometimes even to intervene. So today we ask the following questions. How can museums, foundations, festivals, and cultural prizes remain trusted stewards of heritage while also becoming platforms for urgent contemporary dialogue? How do they stay grounded in a place while speaking to global audiences? And how can they embrace innovation and technology without losing sight of the profound physical, emotional, and political experience of art? And to help us unpack these questions, we're joined today by 2 visionary leaders, each of whom has shaped the cultural landscape in unique and transformative ways. To my left is Manuela Lucà-Dazio, Executive Director of the Pritzker Architecture Prize, and she's redefining the prize's role in a world where architecture must respond to deep ethical and ecological challenges. She brings a rare blend of curatorial sensitivity and institutional strategy to one of the most prestigious honors in the field. Prior to her role at the Pritzker, she served for many years as the managing director of Venice Biennale's Art and Architecture department, where she helped shape some of the most influential exhibitions of the 21st century. Azu Nwagbogu, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, is the founder and director of both African Artists Foundation and Lagos Photo Festival. He has championed African visual culture and challenged dominant Western narratives. His curatorial work, ranging from Staging Times in 2023 to citywide installations, foregrounds community experimentation and social critique. Azu has been instrumental in supporting emerging artists and reframing global narratives around African contemporary art. Manuela and Azu, welcome to the panel, and let us begin. My first question is for you, Manuela, and you can advance the slides as you see fit. The Pritzker Architecture Prize is considered one of the most prestigious and influential awards in architecture, and indeed often it is referred to as the Nobel Prize of the field. So what responsibility do award-giving institutions have in influencing political discussions on urbanism, social housing, and public infrastructure?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with Aku and Jelena. Well, I think that there are 2 different and yet very intertwined ways in which institutions can, and I'm now taking the 2 examples of the Venice Biennale and the Pritzker Prize, very different, but they also have something in common, in which awards can have a deep influence on the political discussion, on the social, natural, and built environment. The first is whether we are able to, sorry, I'm bad with this, okay, whether we are able to look at awards, any award, as a way, not just as an acknowledgement of a body of work or a career, but also as a reflection of the present moment, and even more important from my point of view, as a commitment and a responsibility for the future. And the second way is whether we are able to expand the platform for the political discussion and to make it as inclusive and diverse as possible. Architects, you know, they have the big, and artists too, they have the big privilege and responsibility to shape, to design our world. But especially architects, they can't do it alone. Architects need clients. And by clients, I mean not just governments, I mean patrons, of course, but also communities. And communities means every single one of us. I think everybody should not delegate their future and should be involved in a joint process.
Manuela has just said, the African Artists Foundation promotes both emerging talent and civic engagement. How can cultural platforms like the African Artists Foundation reshape civic consciousness and societal engagement across Africa?
Thank you for that great question. I think coming back to Manuela's point about the contemporaneity of the prize, it's very similar to the relevance of institutions responding to the most urgent social issues. You and I were discussing earlier on about the NSAS campaign that happened in Lagos, in Nigeria, and how photographers and artists and musicians rallied around to create a safe space for people to engage with civic demonstrations, to express their interest in creating change. African Artists Foundation, at the time, we sent a truck with a printer, with the power, with electricity, to be able to support the photographers who were out there documenting the campaign. And right now in Serbia, you see the young students self-organizing, demonstrating against corruption in government and demanding change. So I think, there were art institutions, I'm sure, in Serbia on the ground supporting that campaign without being, seen, without waving the big flag about what they're doing. All of the set of campaigns have a certain sophistication that only art and artists and institutions that are thinking about the contemporary moment and how change happens are able to support. I mean, it's just something as little as providing a charging port for you to be able to change your SD card as a photographer and to upload your images quickly and send them in the cloud. It's such an incredibly powerful way of preserving the moment and preserving and archiving the demonstrations that were happening. But coming back to what we've done at the African Artists Foundation over the years, we launched in 2008 the National Art Prize that really allowed young contemporary artists to get recognition for the work that they were doing. And it became such an influential platform to that, I'd say every single artist from that era who every single artist that you can think of, most of the Nigerian artists that you can think of that are well known and recognized, or in some way played a part in the National Art Prize, whether they participated or they were winners. And so these events are not, these intention events are designed with intention to capture the audience, to capture the imagination of the public and the artists at the time. And the way we designed it at the time, we created a thematic approach to it. So each year we found a theme that was urgent, because artists are really barometers of society. They're always able to feel and represent and not illustrate, but represent in a way that you have an emotional truth, an emotional connection with the event at the time. And so if you're able to create like the Pritzker Prize, it will recognize in those people that are, that have a strong connection with the moment, and they bring it into the space where we can reflect on it in an artistic way. There's nothing really more powerful than that. So, yeah.
Turning now towards a related subject, we want to talk also a little bit about representation, decolonization, and narrative power. And architectural historian Kenneth Frampton has argued that architecture is inherently political, stating that it has always a political dimension, and that the architect's role is to engage with both the social and political dimensions of the built environment. So how can architectural story or storytelling serve as a tool for justice, for visibility, and for reconciliation, especially in post-conflict and post-colonial contexts? And how might a global prize like the Pritzker adapt its criteria to acknowledge such socially and ecologically responsive work without becoming overtly political?
Well, let me start by saying that since 1979, when it was established, the criteria and the mission of the Pritzker Prize has stayed unchanged, which is to acknowledge a living architect or architects for a body of built work, of course, that has created constant and consistent benefits to humanity and the built environment through the art of architecture. So these are the two pillars: benefits to humanity and the built environment, and the art of architecture. And of course, these have been interpreted in different ways by the juries and the laureates, but they've always been present and never excluding each other. And the deliberation happens regardless of any political agenda. But if we think for a moment of the etymology of the word politica, which means for the polis, for the community, then I would say that every single deliberation is and has to be political because it's for the people. And, architectural storytelling can definitely play a deep, important role in this, in post-colonial or post-conflict or even post-natural disaster context. And
could you give us an example, for instance?
For me, I'll give you a couple of examples. For me, it's about rebuilding identity and collective memories. Is like re-enhancing the spirit of a community in a way that can still be in a dialogue with the global context. So for me, it's more about a balance between global and local perspectives, which is in a way quite difficult. But let me give a couple of examples from the Pritzker point of view. The first is Liu Jiakun, who is this year's laureate. Among the many characteristics of his work, there is this called rebirth bricks, which I found quite interesting and moving also. So for a certain moment of his professional life, meaning until the material, the raw material the source material was available, he reused the bricks coming from collapsed buildings from the big earthquake in Sichuan, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, which is the region where he works and lives. And so he mixed the leftovers of the bricks with other local materials like soil, sand, or stone to create new materials, new bricks, which were embodying not only the reminiscence of the existing destroyed buildings, but also of the memories and the life of a community. Here you can see just one building as an example. It's a beautiful kiln museum in Suzhou. And another example that I think is really fitting our topic is Francis Queret. I'm sure every one of you is more or less familiar with his work. What I find really meaningful is his first building. As soon as he became an architect, he went back to Burkina Faso, to his own village, to build a school with the first money that he earned, just to sort of repair something that he had lived in first person. Every single morning as a child, he used to bike or walk for 25 or 7, I forgot what he told me, kilometers, from his village to the next village where the school was, under the heat, in the heat of Burkina Faso. And he promised himself and his community, he went back, he built the first school of his village. And he built it, of course, using local materials, clay, local techniques, which is part of his working philosophy, and with the community. So the whole community was involved in this process with their more or less developed skills. So the result was that, of course, children were not allowed on the construction site for obvious security and safety reasons. And he told me that there was a sort of revolution. They felt excluded and they felt offended. They wanted to be part of a process to build something that was destined to themselves. So in the end, this was the result of the process, and I think this is what can really show how architecture can definitely work on local and global perspectives from this point of view.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of Akwi and Visor, who once described curators as mediators between past and present. And for African curators, this often means pushing back against simplified narratives and reclaiming these complex, contested histories on the global stage. So, as a curator, Azu, how do you navigate your ethical responsibility in storytelling through visual culture, particularly when representing African identities to international audiences, but ensuring also that the narratives remain community-driven, nuanced, and authentic, and do not reinforce colonial stereotypes or exoticized perspectives?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Coming back to the idea of architecture and building the platform for future engagement so that you can think about how you create a safe space for these sort of less cliched or less hackneyed narratives. I think, you're building the physical architecture like Francis Carey has done, but there's also the idea to build the intellectual architecture that allows for a decolonized narrative. And you'd find that there are two kind of pillars that through which curatorial manifestation of African histories have been offered to us in contemporary art and contemporary visual culture. And it's the concept of Afrofuturism and Afropessimism, which Okwuemweze was a big, I'd say, critique of, So this idea that blackness and is excluded from humanity and is fungible and is replaceable and is not valued as separate from, ontologically separate from humanity, is something that has created this problematic representation of blackness throughout visual culture. And photography is implicated in that, And then the other oscillation, the other, arch that is a problem in representing Black culture and African culture is also the idea of futurism. This idea that there are Black people in the future, or there is, we will survive type of thing. These two oscillate between the past and the present, the past and the future, but refuse the agency of the present time. And then my work really is about thinking about how we move away from these sort of narratives, this sort of visual representation. The image to the top right on your screen won the Pulitzer Prize in '94, I think it was. Kevin Carter for the girl, the vulture. I mean, to think that an image like that would win the Pulitzer Prize, right? 3 weeks later, the photographer committed suicide and killed himself. And then, contemporary artists have been working to remediate the context of such narrative by, Ayanna Jackson's work to the left of my screen, to the right of your screen, where she sort of creates a parody of that over misrepresentation. So I think the word that comes to mind when I think about representation is really changing curatorial proposition towards thinking about how you bring this conversation into the present time and not constantly oscillating between pessimism of the past and futurism in the future. And that requires curatorial nous, curatorial know-how, curatorial engagement, and vigilance. You know, a lot of curators that are working today just fall into the automatic patterns that they've sort of inherited from 20th century conception of museology. We need to be thinking about the 21st century conception of museology, and this is why being here in Qatar, being in the Middle East in general, where museums are springing up and are thinking about a new form of alliance, a new form of civic engagement, is very exciting to me in my practice.
Thank you very much. And staying with the same topic of global ambitions and local roots of what is happening in the art and architecture fields, the inclusion of the Nigerian pavilion at Biennale di Venezia in 2015 marked a milestone in bringing African perspectives to a global stage, but it also underscored the ongoing challenge of integrating diverse narratives into established Western frameworks. So as somebody who has worked at Venice Biennale for many, many years and who has been engaged in both art and architecture exhibitions there, how do you view the role of such platforms in expanding art and architectural discourse beyond the Western canons?
Definitely the case of the Venice Biennale is very paradigmatic from many points of view. So since 130 years now, the Venice Biennale is still one of the oldest institution of its kind and one of the most, if not the most important one. And I would say here is just a quick chronology of how the institution developed from 1893 when it was decided to establish the Venice Biennale, 95 when it was opened the first art exhibition. And we will go back to that. But the thing is that, the Venice institution cannot be really, the Biennale institution cannot be really understood other than in a wider context of the city of Venice. Why? Because the city of Venice traditionally, and for historical, geographical, political, commercial reasons, has always been a key point between the north and the south and the east and the west. I think it goes even beyond the Western canon. Traditionally, when Venice in the 14th century became the most relevant, the most important trading partner along the Silk Road. So how did it happen? It happened by overcoming political, religious, and cultural differences. The Venetian Republic expanded a network in the whole Eastern Mediterranean. It happened through the establishment of Venetian outposts in the main cities and regions of the Near East, as you can see here in the 15th, 16th century. And on the other hand, hosting sort of embassies, representations of those same countries in Venice. So again, we go back to the global and local dimensions. And if you think of the Venice Biennale, centuries later, it's the same spirit of, and the same vision to establish an international platform for global exchange to kind of open up to not only to the east, but also to the north and the south and the rest of the world, but from a very local perspective, so with a strong local background in a way. And so I think it's not just about the pavilions, the idea of the pavilions at the Venice Biennale comes from that. So I think it's not just about the Western canon, I think it's more about establishing a platform for exchange, for overcoming cultural differences, for having a common ground for discussion, so that it's more like, I see it at least as more as a dialogue between the entire global north and global south through mutual exchange, as each part has something to teach for sure and something to learn from the other.
For sure, but in recent years, decades, etc., do you see you haven't been around for that long, but do you see more of a interest in affirming this cross-cultural exchange than it was before? Or was it like that from the very beginning?
I would say so, and there is a moment in the history of the Biennale that's particularly meaningful. That is also when I arrived in '99. There was the last, more or less, reformation of the statute, and the Biennale became passed from legally, changed its status from a governmental institution to a semi-public foundation. And in that moment, well, this is a long, complex history, but that was a moment when the whole format of the Venice Biennale was questioned. And there was a lot of pressure to abolish the national pavilions because they were considered obsolete, maybe precisely because they were reflecting this sort of Western kind of culture, the idea of the expos, the universal expos, and so on. The decision was taken in the opposite way, with a lot of discussion, of course, but in the end, it proved to be the right one, because it was the turning point when the idea of the pavilion, I think, changed quickly from representing some sort of colonial powers or established powers all over the world to becoming more open, more inclusive. You know, the number of pavilions went up from nearly, well, 32 in the Giardini as an historical venue, and then opening up to temporary pavilions, more or less at the end of the 90s, it was around 40-something, 50 pavilions. Right now, we have nearly 90 pavilions, which means 90 countries participating. And the other interesting thing about the Venice Biennale is that pavilions, the countries are not asked to participate. The request has to come to the government, and then the country is automatically invited. There is no request from the side of the Biennale. So it's a very spontaneous request, and which means reflecting a need, a necessity, a wish, a will to be there and to be part of a dialogue.
Thank you. Azu, in your work with the African Artists Foundation and the Lagos Photo Festival, you've been at the forefront of challenging these dominant narratives. What are the main difficulties you face in reconciling the perspectives and histories of the Global South with the often dominant Western narratives presented in global institutions?
I'd say the big obstacle really is, coming back to the idea of hosting, to host is such a powerful thing that the West can do. So you can we all come to go to Venice, for example, to present our ideas, to engage, to decolonize. We use a lot of energy to decolonize institutions in the West and Tate Modern, MoMA, the rest of it. But my work, my interest, and my passion really is more about engaging with the local and hosting ideas. So we want to be able to host the rest of the world. There's such an incredible traditional power in being able to, host people. You set the rules of engagement. And that's not something that, so-called Western civilization has been able to appropriate, to imbibe and evolve its own culture. And so if I say to most people, oh, I'm interested in something to do with African heritage or whatever, people, or African urban, if I mention anything to do with history in Africa, in the arts, people immediately think about masks or objects that have a kind of ethnographic meaning. And if you have the same conversation, say in the West, people think about of contemporary visual culture. So that means that, there's a suspension of our imagination in the past when we think about, Africa or majority world countries in general. And so I'd love to shift the center, the periphery, so-called periphery, a little bit more into the center by the opportunity to host. What we have here is we are being hosted in another part of the world so we can engage with this culture. And you think you know, but you really don't know until you plant your feet on the ground here Spent 5 minutes in the National, maybe 10 minutes in the National Museum, and I learned so much in 10 minutes I want to learn in 10 years, of ignorance about Qatar. And so, when you're able to host, you're able to impart, you're able to create a dialogical framework for engagement, for knowledge sharing. And what we all do in the world that we live in and we operate in is the conception of a common humanity. The conception of a common humanity is lost when there is the monoculture. We have to go to the Mecca of the West, of Venice, of Paris, of London, New York, to present our ideas. So I'm grateful because I had a show in Venice last year, as you know. So it's not that I'm against Venice. I love being out there, but I love to see a lot more happening in the majority world scenarios, like here, like in Africa, because it allows us to share on an equal footing and exchange and engage.
In the same vein, I would like to move to the topic of the role that art plays in cultural diplomacy. For instance, historian Tony Judd once described culture as a space where we imagine the lives of others, suggesting its vital role in diplomacy and also in empathy. Manuela, drawing on your extensive experience with both the Venice Biennale and the Pritzker Prize, in what ways do high-profile platforms like those two advance cultural diplomacy and function as mechanisms of soft power in the global arena?
Well, talking about, I think arts in general, art, architecture are, of course, the most privileged and probably the best platforms to address issues like cultural diplomacy with all the possibilities that is involved. I'm just going, it's a long and complex discussion, of course. I'm just going to bring two examples of what cultural diplomacy might mean from the point of view of the Venice Biennale and the Pritzker Prize. Well, these are two images. The one, the black and white one, is the construction of the central pavilion at Giardini in 1893, ready in 1895. So this was really like the seminal moment when the Biennale was really born. And the other image is the Yasmin Lari Pavilion that will represent Qatar this year for the first time at the Venice Biennale. In a temporary way, of course, as you all know, the permanent pavilion project has been launched and it will take place, it will happen. This is really quite symbolic. From a chronological point of view, this was the very beginning, and 130 years later, the ending point for the moment of the process. And this really represents the whole evolution of an institution and what cultural diplomacy can do. The Biennale has always been a platform where, through the presence of these pavilions, a multiplicity of voices can be expressed and can be heard and can be in a dialogue. Sometimes the dialogue is a nice and positive, a smooth one. Some other times is a conflictual dialogue. But yet, I think that this is one of the culture, meaning art, architecture, is one of the few platforms where the dialogue can really happen without filters and with very clear, sincere, straightforward presentation of everybody's points of view. I'm sure every one of you will have seen pavilions in Venice from different countries, expressing very different and contradictory points of view, yet standing one next to the other. You get out from one pavilion, you get into another one, and you change your mindset. You're able to, they activate your own reflection, your own critical spirit. This, I think, is the added value of an institution like that and a format like that. It can really be like fostering and triggering the critical reflection of every single visitor in its own personal way. And from the point of view of the Pritzker Prize, I would just let these images speak. These are bad quality images, but I'm showing them because Francis Guerre sent them to me a couple of months after he was announced as the Pritzker laureate. He went back to Burkina Faso. This is the first time he went back after the announcement. And you know what they did? The government established one national day of holiday in honor of Francis Guerre to celebrate not a pop star, not
Because it was so
a
rare
sports
for
star.
somebody to win such an honor?
Architecture, yes, absolutely. So it became some kind of a national pride. And these, I have videos which are even more expressive, but these are just a few images. There were people dancing in the street, there were people singing, people on bicycles, people on motorbikes, cars. He was sitting on the top of a car showing his medal around. I think this is the best explanation of what cultural diplomacy can mean. The same I heard from their own words happened in Chile when Alejandro Aravena got his Pritzker Prize in 2016, and right now even in China with Liu Jiakun. So although architecture is not music, is not fashion, is less popular in a way, and we will talk about it later, I think this is what can really express better than any word what an institution can do in terms of cultural diplomacy.
Indeed, indeed. It reminds me of numerous examples from Venice, from the Giardini, where you, for instance, can visit the Czechoslovakian pavilion, or Yugoslav pavilion, which says Yugoslavia. It also says on the side Serbia. So for those who don't know political backgrounds of these countries, it can be quite confusing.
But also could be the right moment to learn more.
Exactly.
And it's interesting that now Qatar will have a permanent presence in the Giardini, and together with Egypt, this would be the representation of this part of the world.
Can you tell us where it will be situated?
Yes, I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the venue. It's going to be very central position in between the Sterling Pavilion, in the area that's surrounded by Sterling Pavilion, the Book Pavilion, Denmark, United States.
Yes.
Very well located.
Very, very central.
In the center,
on the center
of the dialogue.
on the plaza. Thank you. Continuing with the relevance of art, photography, architecture, all of this, and its direct relevance on real life. Following the, I don't know if people are familiar with End SARS protests in Nigeria. This was a youth-led movement against police brutality and systemic injustice. The role of art in shaping political consciousness was brought to the forefront in global media. Art as practiced and supported by organizations such as African Artists Foundation goes beyond the art, beyond the cultural or artistic expression, and it becomes a powerful tool for holding up a mirror to society and challenging injustices. And before this conversation, we talked about another project you're doing, which very much sounds like how to integrate art into the larger story of what is happening in the world today. Not to call it political, but most people would, because it's referencing a historical movement, a non-allied movement from the 60s and 70s. And I'm sure many of you who are from the non-allied countries will recognize it. Could you tell us a little bit about that project? It's truly something completely new and stunning, I would say.
It's, yeah, it's something I've been obsessed with for a while now. You know, studying the current global turn and thinking about the immediate post-independence in Africa in the 60s and, you know, the dramatic turn around the end of the Second World War, and the energy around that time, the excitement, the buzz, to create a new movement of solidarity. And I believe most people would agree that the chaos that we witness in the world today and the sort of unmasking, you know, of so-called Western kind of just a hegemony, the demystification of that means that we need to start thinking about new alignment, new forms of solidarity. And maybe, and over the last 4 or 5 years, I'd say there was a conscious return to indigenous knowledge systems. So this postmodern philosophy, if you like, around the individual is sort of collapsing around us, I believe. It's cannibalizing itself, where people that have 150 billion tell you that 1% that goes to aid is a weakness. And so we've reached such a turn, an absurd turn in a sort of common sense that we need to start thinking about new forms of alliances. And it's not about, one of the problems of the contemporary is that we're constantly thinking that knowledge is in the present. But truly, there's a lot of knowledge in the archive in the past. People have been thinking about these ideas before me, you, all of us here. They've written, they've articulated those ideas. All we need to do is go back, go back to the archives around the 70s, the 60s, Boss Tito, Kwame Nkrumah, Yasser Nasser. A lot of great thinkers understood that we can create a new alignment, a new form of solidarity that is not only political, but intellectual, driven by knowledge systems, exchange, mutual respect, equal, eyeball to eyeball, same level, trade, innovation. In Lagos, Nigeria, nearly 50 years ago, there was a huge gathering of Black and diasporic people in Africa, in Lagos, called Festac, a big celebration that had a full month of engagement. There was a colloquium. There are the archives of the colloquium. They debated food security. They debated energy, global warming. All of these conversations they had in 77, nearly 50 years ago, and the archives are there. I don't think there's anything new that we can add to the work of the great thinkers of that era. So the non-aligned movement really is about tapping into the intelligence of that period. A lot of these ideas, just to say, were sabotaged, intentionally sabotaged, So we need to sort of go back to those ideas, critically, intelligently mine and fertilize it with our own contemporary knowledge, using, technology, using innovation, forms of it, to create a new form of solidarity of majority world people, the 90% of the world that exists outside of Europe and the US, that can think about a way to create an example around community, collectivism. This individual manifestation of our existence is really failing us. And I think that we need to go back into a collective way of thinking that artists have always done, indigenous cultures have always promoted, and the non-aligned movement really embodied in its methodology.
Indeed, it sounds fascinating and very new. So thank you for that. I will ask you just one final question, a very quick question, and then we can open this for the audience, questions from the audience. If you could challenge one assumption about what a museum, a biennale, a prize, or a festival should be, what would it be? And what would you propose instead? So let's start with Manuela.
Well, very briefly, I think a platform for experimentation and multidisciplinarity, where risk is encouraged and imperfection is allowed.
Can you tell us what is necessary for that to thrive? It sounds great, but what do you need?
Well, for an institution, this I think would require, even for an institution, leaving the comfort zone from time to time and opening up You know, it's always, all the themes that we have been discussing, I think they're all recurrent. So it's very much, from my point of view, about combining the global and local perspective, opening up, make this platform as diverse and inclusive as possible. You know, diversity and inclusivity, I think they're closely related. The one cannot bring good results without the other. So it's really about running the risk of, you know, challenging the traditional format of any institution, framing it in the local perspective, but opening it up to the global one. It's easy to say, way less easy to do, of course. And the older the institution is, of course, the more difficult, but the more interesting, because history, as you said before, Ako, is also, in terms of heritage, brings a lot of possibilities in terms of past experience. So it can be a burden sometimes. It can also be an additional tool.
I agree with Manuel. I think risk, coming back to experimentation, imperfection, and being nimble. Institutions should embrace the imperfections, the uncertainty, the doubt. And I also believe that we should move away from art as something that is a moral position. You know, I think it's a real, because artists and art institutions in general have associated themselves a lot with brands. And so brands have to embrace a very risk averse. And so any hint of controversy becomes an inherent problem or risk for the institution. I think we should begin to understand art as a space for uncertainty, institutions, biennales, and for redemption. You know, this sort of idea that this person said this and we need to kill that person and bury them in the ground is absurd. You know, we really need to embrace the space for redemption, for healing, for correction, for evolution of our knowledge and of our sensibility. So it shouldn't be certain that we should embrace a bit more doubt in the way we think about these.
And even, if I may add, even in terms of the way we look at disciplines, I think multidisciplinarity is something that we talk about a lot, but to really blur and bridge the different disciplines is also something that is less easy than one would think, but can bring really very interesting results, don't you think? I mean, I'm not the one supposed to do the questions.
No, you're right, completely right. You know, this monoculture, this is a singer, and this is a writer, all of that can be smashed into one wonderful pie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those inspiring words. We have a couple of minutes left, so maybe 2 questions from the audience, if there are any. Here in front.
Thank you for your comments and for the interesting talk. I was thinking in the UAE, where I came from this morning, and in Qatar also, about the history of architecture. And in the 20th century, it seems to me that a paradigm for architecture was a museum, because museums were built in times of peace. Museums were built thanks to great industrial leaps and technological leaps, which we celebrated in the 20th century, but they also redeemed this industrialization because they humanized it. And my question is, if we can say that the museum, in a way, was the paradigm of architecture for culture in the 20th century, what is the architectural form of the 21st century for culture? Do you think it's still the museum as a type? Do you think we should, there is a kind of new format for architecture based on also what you have been talking about? I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but I've been asking myself this question, so I wonder if you have any thoughts.
That's a great question, and I wish I had a precise answer. But what is interesting is maybe that there is not a precise answer, precisely because this is an open, I guess, discussion in this precise moment, not just artistic moment, but also social, cultural, political. There are a lot of possibilities. Architecture, as traditionally, again, we speak about architecture as the museum, the building for a museum. We speak about art as the curator who is going to fill the museum with content. I think if these two disciplines and all the disciplines can start to be in a more, in a deeper and more permanent dialogue, maybe new models could come up. Of course, as I said, architects need clients. So the best results always come from a dialogue among all the parties involved. And what for me is really very important is that also all these institutions are ultimately the expression of a demand. And each one of us as client has the responsibility to inform a very, to generate a very informed and responsible demand. So the museums, for instance, are the expression of a culture. How do we want to be represented in a museum, our culture, ourselves as individuals and other than part of a community? So I think there's a lot, there's a lot of potential in this. Of course, architecture has to adapt to the site, to the context, social, political, geographical, and so on. But for me, the best way would be to really think of new models in a dialogue. What do you think, Ako?
No, I agree completely. You said it perfectly. Nothing to add.
Wow.
Okay, do we have one more question? Over there.
Hello, and thank you for the very inspiring talk. I would have a question for Azu. I think you made some comments that are very thought-provoking. And given that you mentioned Francis Quéré, that I have had the honor to work with for many years, and I think its role in architecture has been also to sort of bridge the gap between theory and praxis, and showing how the process of working with the community and with exploring the potential of materials is the responsibility of an architect. So you mentioned that it's important today when we talk, I mean, the topic of the talk is about the museum, the future of the museum. It's important to empower or to look at cultural institutions based in the Global South. And I think including institutions like Qatar Museum in Doha. But I would be interested to see whether you have any project that you are seeing that is going on in Nigeria or whether in the Global South that is inspiring new forms, new ways of conceiving a cultural institution that perhaps can tell us what is the future of a museum.
It's a great question, but I don't want to sound immodest talking about my project a bit more, but too much more. But well, I've created this idea, this project called Dig Where You Stand, and I'll see if I can pull it up. And the idea is to connect institutions on the continent through meaningful engagement. So somehow institutions tend to compete because we're all looking for the same resources, the same grants, the same sort of, so I created this project called Dig Where You Stand that is sort of rooted in post Cultural Revolution China philosophy that was written by the Swedish philosopher Sven Lindqvist called Dig Where You Stand. And he designed or wrote this manifesto about the workers and the working class people writing their own history. And it's about public history, adult education. And I thought it was really an incredibly powerful way for the Museum of the 21st Century to break the hierarchy. And also I thought it was important to embrace a sort of Pan-African essence in the way that it worked. So we didn't launch it in Lagos in Nigeria, where I'm from. We launched it in Tamale in Ghana, in the at SCCA Tamale, the institution that the artist Ibrahim Mahama built and funded with his own money. And so we did that in 2022, and the exhibition travels excuse me, across the 26 coastal regions that border Africa with its various diasporas. So, the spot where colonizers called the point of no return. We wanted to use that as a sort of metaphor to connect institutions that we don't know, to do a sort of condition report mapping of the situation on the continent in terms of the readiness for institutions to carry exhibitions that have a certain power. And so, so this exhibition has been touring and traveling, and in each iteration, we have a new curator that has a vision for that exhibition. And so that way we're sort of nurturing the next generation of curators, transmitting knowledge and that energy, and connecting and allowing the exhibition to morph. Normally, as you know, as a curator, you say, this is my vision, this is my idea, the exhibition needs to travel like this, and it has to be in this space, and that sort of, following the, monoculture perspective. No, we've changed it a bit, and we want to embrace the experimentation, the uncertainty of it all, such that each young curator that is a part of it can bring the essence of that community into the exhibition. The curator that curated the exhibition that happened in Togo, in Lomé, is from Togo. It's from Ghana, rather, because we launched in Ghana. And then the curator that curated in Benin, the next location, came from Togo. And the curator that curated in Abidjan is from Benin. So we create this network of curators from one country to the other. Also, it was an intention to break the idea of a nation state. These nation states were created not by any African. This is a colonial construct. So we want to break that mold and create a very fluid idea of what, the contemporary museum of the future can be. So.
Thank you very much, Manuela and Azu. And thank you also. And we will take a couple of minutes break before the next panel. Thank you.